And this is what Jesus says. If any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross, and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world, but lose your own soul? Is anything more worth more than your soul? As we continue on this series, it's actually getting longer and longer than I thought. But I came to this passage this week, and I was going to go through the whole thing. But as I was reading verse 25, I just felt like there's no way I could address this topic in 1 week. So I thought about doing it in 2 weeks. And I meditated more, and I realized 2 weeks is probably not enough. The reason why I say that is because Jesus, he kind of asks this question. He says, if you want to be my follower, or if you want to be my disciple, okay? What comes after that, the way I saw it today, is 3 things. Deny yourself, or give up your own way, depending on the new translation. The NLT says, give up your own way, take up your cross, and follow me. And I saw that as 3 separate things. And so what I want to do is kind of unpack this verse a little bit over the next several weeks and look at each of those elements. Today we look at that first aspect, the first, foundation or element or attribute, which is Jesus says, give up your own way. If any of you wants to be my follower, you must turn from your selfish ways, take up your cross, and follow me. Okay? Give up your own way, or deny yourself, according to the NIV, I believe, uses that translation. To be a follower of Jesus, then, Jesus says that you have to give up your own way. And what does that mean? To give up your own way. We want to really unpack that a little bit this morning. To give up your own way. I believe Jesus is talking about self-denial. He's saying, if you want to follow after me, give up your own way. Deny yourself. And what kind of things are we supposed to deny? Hopefully we can kind of get a better understanding as we unpack this a little bit this morning. My desire is that through our time, that you will come to a better understanding of what is Jesus talking about in terms of denying ourselves. What elements, what kind of things, or how does that look like? I think sometimes people mistake that aspect, the dying of the self. Sometimes people mistake that for death to self. They think, I have to give up everything. Myself has to die in order for me to follow Jesus. And is that what he's talking about? I will focus our attention more on the aspect of self-denial. Meaning, if there's something that we want to do, we say, you know what? Is that what God wants me to do? Having that pause to reflect. God has made you and I very unique. No, not 2 of us in this room are alike. We may have similar attributes, or similar interests, similar appearance, but none of us are identical. A friend of mine just had twins, fraternal twins, boy and a girl. It's their child number 2 and 3. So they went from 1 to 3. It's a huge jump. And, I look at them. Right now, when I see them, I don't think they look alike at all. And they're supposed to be twins. So even those who are twins born at the same time, they share so many different attributes. They may share similarities in terms of looks, but they're going to grow to be completely different people. So God has created you and I very uniquely. And so I don't think God is saying, I want to take that all away, death to self. I want you guys all look the same, act the same, talk the same. I don't think that's what he's talking about. But he's saying, I want you guys to live in a way, to follow Christ in a way that's going to be a characteristic or a mark of my follower, of my disciple. God works within you and to reshape, I think, us into the person that he wants us to be. Not to be selfish, not to be concerned about circumstances that affect us or affect only us, and not to be crabby or moody when things don't go the way we want or when we don't get what we want. Self-denial, not death to self. Giving up our own way is about self-denial. And this morning I want to share maybe 3 ways that we live this out. So we're looking at the first statement where Jesus says, if you want to follow me, if you want to be my follower, turn from your own way or deny yourself. Or in this translation, turn from your selfish ways. Okay? That's the aspect that we're looking at. To give up on our own way is to move away from self-centeredness. It's to move away from self-centeredness. To deny yourself means to say no to self, yes to God. But oftentimes we say yes to self, no to God. Okay? To deny yourself means to say no to self, yes to God. But why is that a challenge? It's because most of us, we're selfish. We're self-centered. We want to do things that's in our best interest. You know, I think one of the lessons that I learned as a father is sometimes I have to give up what I want for the sake of my kids. I've had to give up sleep. I've had to give up sometimes in the morning. You know, our summer school started this past week. So my wife, you know, she wakes up, she's off to work. I wake up, I'm getting kids ready. Just like school year when daycare time, I'm getting them ready. But you know, the major difference between now and preschool is I have to take a shower. I have to get ready in the morning because I come to church, drop them off, and I'm in the office and I'm, you know, preparing my things and doing that. At preschool for my kids, I drop them off. I just put on a hat, I go. I come home, I relax a little bit, I eat my breakfast, I shower and whatever. But now it's like everything's more rushed in the morning. So I find that I'm feeding them, I'm getting them ready, I get ready, I come to church and I realize I haven't had breakfast. So certain things that you sacrifice as a father, I realize, you know, I have to die to self for the sake of my children. It's one of those lessons that you learn. If you start dating, you also die to self for the sake of your girlfriend. I mean, more for guys. Girls, you don't really, because you get more and more and more. It's like greatest thing in the world, you know. But this idea of dying to self, it's played out multiple times in our relationships. But we tend to look out for ourselves. We are selfish by nature, and that's just the reality. So to give up our own way means that we move away from the self-centeredness that I think you and I are so accustomed to living. Jesus loved and he cared for us very deeply. And when we look at Jesus and we say, if we want to be a follower of Jesus, we have to look at how did Jesus live? How did Jesus talk? How did Jesus interact with people? How did he love? And when we look at that, we see a certain pattern. He loved all people. You know, one thing our world needs right now is love. I'm sick and tired of turning on the news to hear about some kind of violence that's happening. Not some remote, distant country, but here within our own borders of our nation. This was a tough week. After Dallas, I think it was in Missouri, routine traffic stop, policeman was shot. Police have a target on their backs now because of events that have happened in our nation, not just this year, but over the last several years. At Fuller Theological Seminary, I believe it was either yesterday or the day before, yesterday, Saturday, so Friday, in Pasadena, California, they had what they called a die-in, not a sit-in, a die-in, where people, alumni, students, faculty, they came together and they laid down in the center of the campus. Didn't say anything, and they were simply protesting all of the violence. And their call was this specifically. It was organized by the African American Studies program at Fuller and African American Ministry of Pastoral Studies program. They said, it's time for white evangelicals to not be silent towards the violence. And it was a very interesting thing. I was reading the article about that, but it's a time in our nation when love seems to be in short supply. If we want to be a follower of Jesus, we see, how did Jesus love? He loved and he cared for people deeply. And that's what you and I are called to do. We are, in order to follow after Jesus, in order to die to ourselves, we transition, we move from self-centeredness to Christ-centeredness. That is a shift that has to happen. Because when we are self-centered, we only think about us. When we are Christ-centered, we will begin to think about other people. I have become numb to the violence. It's disheartening. Oh, another shooting. Oh, and that's it. As it happens more frequently, some of us are like, oh, it's just ISIS blowing up other Muslims. Oh, it's fine. We get so numb to that. Giving up our own way actually will free us from being obsessed with ourselves. Giving up our own way, dying to ourselves, will release us from the pressures of being obsessed with ourselves. We're not consumed by the self, but we're consumed by Christ. There's so much in that one little statement that Jesus makes. Jesus, he's not asking us to do something he didn't do himself. He said no to self and yes to God. As he humbly came down to fulfill the will of God the Father. Dying to self actually makes life easier because, for example, we can be content even when we're overlooked. I believe either Billy Graham or somebody within his ministry said this. Dying to self actually makes life easier because, for example, we can be content even when we're overlooked. You know, when we give up our own way, we don't care whether or not we get the credit. We don't care about getting recognition. We're not concerned with these things because we move away from that self-centeredness. We're saying God's approval is enough for me. We don't need the approval of man. How freeing, how liberating would that be? We seek approval of man, of people, of others. We want the approval of our parents. We want the approval of our leaders. We want approval of our managers. We want the approval of our spouses. We want the approval of other people. And we struggle with that. We struggle with getting recognition from man all the time. We get offended when others get the credit for something that we did. I want to take you back into time. There was a series of movies about a young Italian who grew up in Philadelphia in poverty. He rose to fame through boxing. In one of the Rocky movies, I believe it was Rocky 5, Rocky begins to kind of work with this guy named Tommy. He was actually, I think, he's not just in the movie, but I think his name was Tommy the Machine Gun, right? He was a professional boxer as well. So Rocky kind of takes him under his wing. He kind of shows him. And during one of the championship bouts, Rocky's sitting in front of the TV. He's watching him. And he's like doing all the moves, and they're like identical because he taught him everything he knew. He wins. During the interview, they asked Tommy, hey, basically he says, is there anyone you want to thank for giving you this opportunity? And Rocky, the camera focuses on Rocky's face, and you hear it in the background. Yeah, I want to thank everyone. Everybody in the room expects him to say Rocky, but he says his manager's name. And Rocky is kind of, you can tell the disappointment on his face. And he's like, yeah, it's okay. But then, his manager, his trainer guy, right? He's like getting furious. In that moment, we see Rocky's disappointment. He worked so hard with this guy. If anyone deserves credit for getting this guy the championship, it was Rocky. But he gave it to somebody else. Although Rocky says he was okay, definitely was offended. Somebody else got the credit for all the hard work that he put in. In dying to self, we find greater joy in caring for the concerns, interests, and needs of others. We're not weighed down by our own selfishness. We can focus on others and love them as Jesus loved. The second aspect, how I see this played out in our life, is this. To give up our own way is to place Jesus at the center of our lives. To place Jesus at the center of our lives. In Matthew chapter 6, verse 24, let me read that verse for you. No one can serve two masters, for you will hate one and love the other. You will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and be enslaved to money. Jesus, he reminds us that in life there are only one person or one thing that can really have your devotion, have your heart. He calls it master. There's only one thing that we can truly be devoted to. You can't be devoted to more than one thing, basically, is what he's saying. It's not possible to serve two masters. You cannot be enslaved to money, he says, and God at the same time. He's saying that is not possible. He's saying it's not possible because eventually one of the two will eventually win out. And Jesus actually uses he uses much stronger words than that. He says, you will hate the one and love the other. You will be devoted to one and despise the other. This language is very strong. The wording is very strong. It's not just that one wins out. It's that in the process of one winning out, the other becomes an enemy. If we are to die to self, if we are to give up our own way, then we must be made subservient to God, to His will. We must be willing to give up anything in life in order to please God. This is at the core of discipleship. To be a follower of Jesus, to be a disciple of Jesus, the core is that we give up our needs and our wants and submit to God. That we take ourselves out of the seat and let Christ sit. That is the core of discipleship. We no longer choose where we go. God chooses where we go. We live for God, not for ourselves. That's basically what he's saying. Even just this one little statement, to deny self or to die to self. We're saying no to self This is what is required of a follower of Jesus. How can we know where our heart truly lies, God or other things? There's two things that we can look at, time and money. Where we put our time, where we put our money is generally, that's where your heart is going to be. That's easy for us to see. Oh, I'm not sure where exactly my heart is. Well, where are you spending your time? Where are you spending your resources? There's nothing wrong with playing games, shopping, sleeping, taking a nap. Nothing wrong with those things. But if you are serious about becoming a disciple of Jesus, then you have to weigh all of these things that you do with things that you do for God, for His kingdom. How does that play out? Is it tilted one way or another? Jesus specifically, He addresses money and such, but you can really replace that with anything. I think there's a certain season in our life when we are so consumed by, I don't know, what could it be? Career, finances, education, boyfriend, girlfriend. That season is always there. There's things that always seem to compete. There will always be things that compete against God. How we maintain that balance is actually very critical. Where you spend your time and your money most likely is where your heart is, and thus potential master of your life. You can't be a follower of Jesus and serve another master is basically what Jesus is saying here. Your loyalty will eventually reveal itself. You will either love Jesus or come to hate Jesus. I don't hate Jesus. There's no way I would hate Jesus. But in essence, what's happening and what Jesus is pointing out is when you start serving, when you have these two competing things, and you start being devoted to something other than God, what actually is happening is that as you do that, you begin to despise the other. And before you realize it, you have hatred towards that. Why? Because that is contradictory to this. That it keeps you from this. And that's why He's saying, I think that's why He uses those strong words. You will be while your devotion to this continues to grow, hatred towards the other will continue to grow as well. If you serve another master, then in essence, you come to hate Jesus. That's what He's saying. If you want to be a follower of Jesus, give up your own way. Deny yourself. Denying self means that we have to place Jesus at the center of our lives. You will no longer be devoted to follow Jesus. If you're seeking after other things, when your that becomes your master, your devotion becomes that, and you no longer are devoted to follow Jesus. When that happens, He becomes what He's talking about here in this verse, the one that you'd come to despise. Denying self requires us to give up anything that we would want or seek that would hinder our doing the will of God. This does not mean that if we want something, it is necessarily wrong. It means we must take our wants and desires down from the throne and place Jesus and His will as the governing power in our lives. That's what an author wrote from gospelway.com. Denying self means to take our wants and desires down from the throne and place Jesus and His will in place. Replace what we want. We replace what we want with what Jesus wants. We submit to God's will because we place Him at the center of our lives. The third aspect is this: to give up our own way means we are serious about doing the will of God. That we're serious about doing the will of God. I may be guilty of this as well, but I've heard people in prayer or in conversation, they make promises to God without intent to follow through. Or they make promises to God with a condition. What do I mean? We say, Lord, I'll do anything you want. And you know, when God hears that, you know what he's thinking? Really? Okay. Well, John, since you will do anything I want, I want you to go to such and such country. Serve the poor in a third world country. And my response is, Lord, send me anywhere but there. In 1996, I went to a conference in Chicago, University of Chicago at Champaign-Urbana. It's called Urbana, basically. It's a missions conference that happens every 3 years. In 1996, I went to this conference. I took high school seniors and college students. And we took from Portland, there were 10 of us that we went to Chicago. This conference always happens like a day after Christmas, and it ends on January 1st. Now, actually, they moved the conference to St. Louis. It's still called Urbana, but it's actually in St. Louis. But during this missions conference, before I went to this missions conference, I said, Lord, I'll go wherever you call me. I'll serve you faithfully in the mission field. I felt a strong calling that God was calling me to full-time missions. And God gave me a specific heart for Japan. And so as I was going there, I was excited. And I remember, I think it was like the second night, we were worshiping and somebody was speaking. And during our time of response and prayer, I felt like a brick wall just slammed into me. Whereas after, I felt like God was saying, I'm not sending you. I'm not calling you to full-time missions. I went to a missions conference with the heart to go to missions, and God says, I'm not calling you to missions, full-time missions. I'm calling you to the local church to build up and send people out. That's how I will use you. I was like, what? Who goes to a missions conference? God, you brought me to Urbana to tell me you're not going to call me to missions? What? Why don't you just tell me that in Portland? I would have saved money and time. But a person, one of my leaders that went with me, she was next to me. I'm like angry. She's crying because God called her. She never wanted to go to missions. God called her to missions. And she's serving in Mongolia, even now, 20 years later. 20, right? 90s. Yeah, 20 years later, she's serving God in Mongolia as a full-time missionary. It's God, I will do anything you want, but there's a condition. Or God says, I want you to go here. And we're like, well, God, that's great, but maybe you can send so-and-so. Are we really submissive? Are we really able to submit to the will of God? If you want to be a follower of Jesus, you have to submit to the will of God. You have to be serious about following or submitting to the will of God. If we say, God, I will go where you want, and God tells us where we want, and we are resistant, that is not giving up our own way. That is not dying to ourselves. It's only an illusion of being a follower of Jesus, a disciple. Because we are still saying, I will maintain control over my life. See, when I read that statement in verse 24, when I read that again this past week, I said, I cannot go beyond that first statement. Give up your selfish ways, to die to yourself, to deny self. I'm like, what does that look like? Why do we struggle with this? Maybe it's because we don't really fully understand the full ramifications of just that one little statement. When I started looking at take up your cross, I was like, whoa, I cannot. We have to pause. Because I think we've made discipleship just too easy. Oh yeah, just do what God wants. Carry the cross, follow Jesus. But when I start really looking at each of the statements, I realize there's so much more. You know what Jesus says? If you want to be my follower, give up your own way. Get serious about doing the will of God. Take the conditions out. Go where I send you. Do what I call you to do. We cannot claim to be a follower of Jesus while picking and choosing what we obey. We cannot claim to be a follower of Jesus if we don't go all in. You can't carry the cross. You can't take up the cross if you have not died to yourself. You look at Jonah. God said, I want you to go to Nineveh. He said, no way. He knew what God would do. He would go and he would basically spare the people of Nineveh. They were a wicked people. Jonah's like, no, I don't want you to. I want your wrath to come on them. He flees. Even a prophet like Jonah, in this action, the way I look at this through this lens is, he didn't want to do the will of God. Even Jonah didn't want to do the will of God. He was unable to die to self on this aspect, in that one way. He had bitterness towards the people of Nineveh. He said, I want them. I want you to wipe them out. I don't want you to save them. Even after everything happens, he's pouting. He's like, he's angry. And God's like, Jonah, what's up, man? Shouldn't you be happy? I knew this is what you would do. I knew you would save them. That's why I didn't want to come. Even after the fact, even after spending 3 days in the stomach of a fish, and when he sees God work, he's like, oh, God, why did you do this? That's the story of Jonah. It's just amazing to me. Dr. Bill Mouse, in a blog post posted at Western Seminary, that I read from time to time, he said this: to say it differently, the process of denial is to humbly submit my will to God. It is to go through life repeating the words that Jesus said the night before he died. When he was praying in the garden, he said to God, his Father, not my will, but yours be done. When I am hurt, I am called to submit my will to God's will and follow his example. This is what it means to deny yourself. Now, I don't always do it. Sometimes I like to reword Jesus' prayer. Not your will, but mine be done. But that's not what Jesus said. What he's saying is basically, when I'm hurt, and think back to what Jonah was feeling. When I am hurt, I like to say, Lord, let my will be done, not your will be done. Let my will be done. We want to change that phrase a little bit. Jesus wants us to give up our own way to do the will of God. If you want to be a follower of Jesus, he says, give up your own way. And that means do the will of God. A person by the name of Jack Wellman, who is a pastor, he wrote something that actually just, in some way, this is a very scary statement, but actually, and at the same time, I think captures exactly what we're talking about here this morning. He says this: if we don't deny ourselves, we will deny Christ. If we do deny ourselves, we won't deny Jesus. Let me read that again. If we don't deny ourselves, we will deny Christ. If we do deny ourselves, we won't deny Jesus. He says that difference is of supreme importance and has eternal ramifications. Jesus says, if you want to be my follower, give up your own way. Deny yourself. Die to yourself. Giving up our own way basically is to say, Lord, not my will, but your will be done. That is the spirit and that is the position which we are called to take.